In the 1990s, the Soviet system collapsed. In a wave of optimism, Boris Yeltsin came to power in a newly democratic Russia. In a departure from prior politics, he presented a new vision for Russia. He presented a vision of a democratic country, made prosperous by free markets and allied with the United States. His idealism portrayed a theme that recurs in Russian history: occasional flirtations with liberalism and an open society. Yet these liberal experiments always fail, producing anarchy, disorder, and lawlessness, and provoking a return back to authoritarianism. Yeltsin's regime failed due to the shock therapy policy he followed to reform the economy. Rather than gradually transition toward a market system, he supported a rapid privatization of old Soviet industry. One policy of his government was to distribute vouchers that represented ownership in Russia's newly privatized companies. Yet with little understanding of stock ownership or capitalism, most sold these immediately on receiving them. They were bought up by a small minority who became the modern oligarchs. With no history of entrepreneurship, the reality was Russia would need decades to transform its economy, far too long for a democratic government to solidify. The Soviet people were already economically struggling in the 90s after the fall of communism, and Yeltsin's era simply brought more austerity. While support from the United States might have eased the transition, this did not materialize, despite Yeltsin's friendship with President Bill Clinton. Disgraced, emotionally broken, and alcoholic, Yeltsin stepped down from power, appointing the intelligence officer Vladimir Putin as his successor in 2000. Coming out of the chaos of the 90s, Putin slowly consolidated power and restored stability to Russia. This brought economic development in the 2000s, with the Russian middle class developing, mostly concentrated in cities. Russia developed a per capita purchasing power similar to Poland and Hungary, and double that of China. Putin followed the new Russian constitution after serving 2 4-year terms, the model used by the United States. He stepped down from office in 2008. His supporter, Dmitry Medvedev, served as president, while Putin remained in power through a shadow government. Finally, in 2012, he returned to office, and the Russian constitution was amended, so he could remain in power indefinitely. Although Westerners view his regime as authoritarian, it can be viewed as a moderation between the two extremes of Russian politics: the cruelty of Stalin on the one hand, and the anarchic liberty of the 90s on the other. If viewed from this perspective, it's a golden mean between authoritarian and democratic principles. Rather than a bald dictatorship, Putin's regime takes the time to legitimize itself through elections and follow its constitution, showing the Russian system has internalized some democratic principles. Putin practiced open forum events in the 2010s, where citizens could call in and directly ask him questions. Though the questions were curated and respectful, they often invoked difficult topics and showed Putin's openness and desire to represent the popular will. Despite this, intimidation is a pillar of Putin's regime. Used against political opponents, it creates an effective two-party system of Putin's united Russia and the former communists. Critics and defectors are subject to defenestration and poisoning. These consequences occur even in Western countries, showing that defectors cannot flee there for sanctuary. Putin's greatest rival for power was the Russian lawyer Alexei Navalny, who rose to prominence in the 2010s. Though he lacked a realistic path to power, he presented himself as a moral alternative to Putin and expressed the idealism that occasionally manifests in Russia. Having survived poisoning and exile, Navalny returned to Russia, where he was arrested for subversion. Placed in one of the country's infamous Siberian prisons, he suffered the same punishment as Russia's worst criminals. Treated as a traitor, he represented a popular challenger for the country's highest office. Westerners pressured the Russian government to provide Navalny with basic human rights before he was allowed to die of negligence. Putin's regime represents a return to Czarism, the traditional form of Russian government. Centralizing power into one figure, the Tsar provides order and stability, and advances the interests of the Russian people in a kind of social contract. Czarism expresses three tenets of the Russian political consciousness. Brutalism, the idea that brutality is an intrinsic part of life and is required to bring order. Gangsterism, the acceptance of the base pillars of power, violence and extortion, with the latter evolving into taxation. And finally, masculinity, the virtues of being assertive and self-interested. The closest governments to Putin's, which can help in understanding it, are those of Erdogan's Turkey and Orban's Hungary. Called hybrid regimes or liberal democracies, they combine elements of democracy and authoritarianism. Similar to Putinism, we can identify a pattern where despots advance the interests of their ethnicity, while their more democratic peers are pan-European. Another comparison that could be made to Russia is the North Korean government. While nominally a communist power, North Korea has evolved into a hereditary monarchy. The rule of the Kim family, as well as the return of Czarism to Russia, suggests that monarchy is a natural form of government. Without a male successor, monarchy will not emerge in Russia on Putin's death. Instead, Russia's constitution will come into effect. While a new president from the United Russia Party will be elected, they'll enter office without the social clout of Putin. Real power might transition into a council-style government, like that of the Soviet Central Committees, until a new autocrat emerges. Having established the concept of Czarism, we can unpack how it manifests on the world stage. Understanding Russian foreign policy requires a knowledge of history, particularly Russia's experiences of tragedy. The country has faced several disasters, including invasion by the Mongols, Napoleon, and Hitler. This has created a traumatized psychology that manifests as paranoia and a heightened sensitivity to danger on the world stage. Seeking the protection of its core urban areas, during times of stability, Russia expands outward in search of security. It seeks geographic bases on which to ground itself, and lacking these in the great European plain, pursues a buffer area there consisting of the Baltic, Belarus, and Poland. One of the few geographic bases for Russia is the Carpathian mountain range, where its borders rested in the Victorian Age. Yet Russia's expansion makes it responsible for its conquered provinces. Repression and economic misrule then produce separatist movements in those areas. Then, in times of crisis, like 1917 or the 1990s, the system disintegrates and Russia loses its satellites before the cycle repeats itself. Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And from the perspective of Russian diplomacy, this is correct. From a state of complete military security, Russia lost not only its Eastern European satellites, but two historic provinces of Russia, its modern-day sister countries of Belarus and the Ukraine. While the Russians were content to observe these countries' sovereignty, as long as friendly governments remained in power, this changed with the 2014 Euromaidan protests in Ukraine and the Ukraine's election of a pro-European Union president. On the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians received a verbal assurance that NATO, the alliance of Europe and the United States, would not expand eastward and would respect the traditional Russian sphere of influence. For a time, the Russians were content with this, with Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin forming a friendship, and Putin even continuing this effort with Bush Jr., visiting his ranch in Texas when he was president. Putin also received the so-called reset button from Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State under Obama, showing the Americans' sincere desire for good relations. Unfortunately, the reality on the ground makes true detente impossible. In the 2000s, NATO expanded eastward, first adding Hungary, Czechia, and Poland, before accepting the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Despite the alliance's declared defensive nature, NATO coming up to Russia's border has elicited fear and paranoia in the country. With their traditional backyard violated, Russia and the United States are back in an imperial competition, a resurrection of the Cold War. To understand the modern imperial competition requires unpacking the nature of empire in our time. The United States is an example of a hegemonic empire, different from the territorial empires of the past. It's a state that's become overwhelmingly powerful relative to its peers, but chooses to coexist with rather than conquer them. This creates a stable diplomatic system and radiates the influence of the empire outward through soft power. The closest comparison to the American Empire are the Delian and Peloponnesian leagues of ancient Greece. These were alliances of co-equal powers, with similar values, forms of government, and economic systems. Though they were presided over by a hegemon, they made decisions, like war and peace, through consensus. From this perspective, we can view the American alliance system, which includes NATO, as well as Japan and South Korea, as an imperial federation. A core pillar of its power comes from the Atlantic trading system. Called Atlanticism, the idea was put forward by Alfred Thayer Mahan in his book The Influence of Sea Power in History. The thesis of his work was that whichever fleet controlled the Atlantic in its trade would be able to dictate the world's politics. This was correct in the time of the British Empire. It recurs today with the United States. Russia has developed an alternative to the American-led system, associated with the political theorist Alexander Dugin. It envisions an overland empire of an economically and socially united Eurasia under Russian leadership. While Russia will remain a major geographic power, the theory has little use outside of internal legitimacy, where it's an expression of Russian exceptionalism. The reality is overland trade is always more expensive than maritime trade, meaning the overland empire can never compete economically on the world stage. While the bear is the historic analogy given to Russia, a more appropriate comparison today may be to an injured tiger. Today, Russia is in a paradoxical situation. While it controls the world's largest nuclear arsenal and the power of global annihilation, its conventional military is too weak to subdue a neighboring third world power. This means Russia's ambitions exceed what it's militarily capable of. While it remains a dangerous predator on the world stage, Russia would struggle against China or the United States in a conventional war. However, its nuclear arsenal grants it immunity to invasion and the ability to demand deference from the other great powers. Russia struggles to understand why states want to voluntarily join the American-led order. It sees movements to do so as products of American espionage rather than organic desire. Since joining NATO and the European Union, the per capita income of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania has matched that of the West. Similar developments have occurred in Poland and Hungary, where after half a century of frozen social development under communism, have been reintegrated back into Central Europe. The Americans practice a form of moral imperialism. They export their system abroad, encouraging democratic rule, constitutionalism, and free markets in their allies and satellites. This process has occurred successfully in places like Poland, Italy, and Japan, but has failed elsewhere, such as in Iraq and Afghanistan. As we mentioned, the 2014 Euromaidan protests in the Ukraine represent a major shift in Russian politics. The Ukraine divided between two candidates, the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych and pro-EU Petro Poroshenko. This internal rivalry in the Ukraine expressed itself as a conflict between ethnic Russians and Ukrainians. Called the Little Russians in history, the Ukrainians have an ambiguous sense of nationality. They were often subsumed under the Russians, while at other times they appeared as a discrete national consciousness. Stalin's famine, called the Holodomor, may be one of the most important sources of Ukraine's modern national identity. Having caused a food shortage after collectivizing agriculture, instead of distributing its effects evenly, Stalin imposed all the famine's consequences on the Ukraine. Losing about 12% of their population in Stalin's famine, his goal was to pacify the Ukraine and retain it as a subordinate province. Today, the action has the opposite effect. If they're discreet enough to be targeted by a genocidal action, then the Ukrainians are a different people than the Russians. In the eastern Ukraine, separatist movements arose in Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014, triggering the Russian military to enter and occupy those provinces. Meanwhile, a rapid deployment to the Crimean Peninsula resulted in its annexation into Russia the same year. While Westerners were in disbelief, events escalated in 2022 with a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Despite hopes for a quick victory, their drive to Kiev was cancelled as fighting settled along the Dnieper in eastern Ukraine. The war now was over the territorial settlement in Ukraine, which areas will be annexed into Russia, and which will enter the European Union. The war can be viewed as a Ukrainian civil war that escalated into a larger conflict. The Ukrainians have shown valor, but will need at least half a century to see the dividends of aligning with the West. As war often develops a sense of national identity, like French and English did from the 100 Years' War, and Spanish from the Reconquista, the conflict will solidify a Ukrainian national consciousness. This Ukrainian identity will then pursue its own destiny on the world stage, rather than want to return to be a province of Russia. As we mentioned, one of the motivations for the Ukraine war is for Russia to find geographic bases on which to ground itself. An irony of the war is that by pursuing its security, Russia may again be repeating its historical cycle of overextension. Like other countries, Russia faces the sub-replacement rate crisis, averaging 1.4 births per couple. If maintained, Russia's population will contract by 33% per generation. This means that even if it acquires more advantageous frontiers, it may lack the population needed to garrison these areas. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has also caused a brain drain. Early images of the war showed trains of educated Russians fleeing to neighboring countries, anticipating a wave of hypernationalism and a crackdown on individual liberties as the war escalated. Many of these expatriates include young and entrepreneurial Russians who were crucial to the country's development. The result is Russia choosing territorial expansion over internal development. Finally, the invasion has resulted in two of Russia's neighbors, Finland and Sweden, abandoning neutrality and joining NATO, revealing the underlying political situation. After coming to power in the Republican Party as an insurgent candidate, Donald Trump has expressed his desire to radically change American diplomacy. His central change has been to recognize the legitimacy of dictators, referring to them as smart, capable leaders. He's departed from America's traditional moral demands in foreign policy. By recognizing that despots do actually represent the popular wills of their peoples, and that non-democratic means to power are legitimate, he's better able to develop relations on the world stage. Despite this, Trump is unable to achieve real rapport with Putin due to the de facto political division of Europe between Russia and the United States. In a previous video, we explored the psychology of Hungarians, tracing their insurgent behavior in the European Union to resentment they felt from the Treaty of Trianon. In another, we explored how England's desire for independence came from their position on an island. After centuries of fighting against European unity, they exited the pan-European project through Brexit. Like the Hungarians and English, we can unpack Russian history to gain insight into their unique national consciousness. In doing so, we can better understand their government and foreign policy. Guilt appears as a theme in the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of Russia's great writers. He explored guilt in his most famous work, Crime and Punishment. In Crime and Punishment, the main character Raskolnikov commits a murder, killing his elderly landlady to steal a small amount of money from her. He then descends into mental illness, developing delusions to justify his crime. Guilt becomes an existential part of his life, recalling original sin in Christianity. Eventually, his torment becomes so much that he confesses to his crime, accepting exile and hard labor in Siberia as his penance. Raskolnikov's tale reflects something deep in the Russian consciousness. As a Christian country, Russians believe that all individuals possess inherent dignity, a product of their being made in the image of God. Yet this contrasts starkly with day-to-day reality in Russia, where hardness and violence are needed to govern the country. This moral contradiction creates a sense of guilt, which then seeks absolution through hardship and hard labor. Courage is another theme of Russian history. It manifests in sacrifice for the benefit of others, recalling the voluntary death of Christ on the cross. We see courage in the Chernobyl liquidators, who accepted personal harm to repair the disaster. We see it in the heroism of the Soviet soldiers in the Second World War, who followed Stalin's order not to take one step back in the face of the German invaders. And we see it in Navalny's death, who accepted the voluntary death of a secular saint, giving his life for Russia's conscience. Idealism is another theme of the Russian consciousness, standing in stark contrast with the day-to-day reality of life in Russia. It expresses a dream of a better world. Leninism is the best example of Russian idealism. A 20th century prophet, Lenin presented a vision to the Russians of a world united by socialism, equal and just, progressing collectively into the future. Russian idealism occurs again in the 1990s, during the democratic experiment with Yeltsin. It occurs in 1917 in the Democratic Revolution, and it occurs in the life of Alexei Navalny, who accepted his death voluntarily for Russia's conscience. We see idealism in the new Soviet man, a vision of citizen that developed during the communist period. It was a vision of a citizen who accepted hard labor and personal impoverishment for the overall benefit of the community. As we said, idealism in Russia ends in disappointment. Lenin's socialist experiment failed and didn't even last a century. Yeltsin's regime led to chaos, while the 1917 democracy fell to the Bolsheviks. Navalny died while never having had a realistic path to power. Meanwhile, the Soviet citizen never reaped the dividends of the labor of the new Soviet man. Yet, like an ember, idealism remains in the Russian consciousness. Overall, Putinism is an example of Czarism, Russia's natural form of government. After restoring stability to the country, Putin has reasserted Russia's three fundamental principles on the world stage: autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. While Western observers look at Russia and see only a despotism, it represents a moderation of Russian politics between the extremes of Stalinism and the democratic anarchy of the 1990s. While Russia is authoritarian, it also embraces democratic principles as a source of legitimacy, including taking time to hold elections and following its constitution. Putin's open forum events of the 1910s show his desire to represent the popular will. Visions of Russia are often bleak and dystopian, showing pictures of people living solitary lives amidst the ruins of the post-industrial age and socialist idealism. It is a country that drinks itself into cirrhosis and death, where isolation and social atomization lead to diseases of despair. Yet the Russian government, following an efficient brutalism, continues to prove its fitness on the world stage.